I stepped inside, drained from the long day, expecting nothing more than a quiet night. But instead of the usual warmth of home, I was met with a silence that felt wrong. A kind of silence that didn't belong here. On the couch, my mother, my wife, my sons, and my best friend, Raymond, all sat together. Their faces unreadable, their eyes carefully avoiding mine. Something was off. Not the kind of tension that sometimes settled in when I worked late. It wasn't the faint scent of burnt food from Helen's latest failed attempt at dinner. It wasn't even the rigid way my sons sat, as if bracing for something they couldn't stop. No, this was different. This was intentional. I set my briefcase down, rolling my shoulders as I tried to gauge the atmosphere. What's going on? My voice was steady, controlled. But no one answered right away. That pause sent a cold ripple down my spine. Then, after what felt like an eternity, my eldest son, Ethan, cleared his throat. When he finally spoke, his words would be burned into my memory forever. Dad, sit down. You need to understand something. You're not the one leading this family anymore. Uncle Raymond, he's more of a father to us now. The words cut through me like a blade. I blinked, convinced I had misheard. What? My voice was calm. Too calm for the fire that suddenly ignited in my chest. Ethan wouldn't meet my gaze. His fingers tapped against his knee, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. My focus shifted to the one person who should have spoken up. Helen. She sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. Not shocked. Not apologetic. Just neutral. She knew. They all did. My mother shifted slightly, letting out a quiet sigh, as if this was something inevitable. No shock. No outrage. Complicit. And Raymond? My so-called best friend? He didn't move. He didn't even try to defend himself. His posture was easy, almost casual, like this was just another business meeting. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Like he belonged there. Like he'd been sitting in my seat for a long time. The realization hit me like a hammer to the ribs. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This had been planned. I scanned my sons' faces, searching for a crack, a moment of hesitation, anything that might tell me this wasn't what they truly wanted. But Ethan held firm. And Caleb, my youngest, though quieter, didn't look away. He didn't deny it. A slow breath filled my lungs as I forced the anger simmering beneath my skin back into place. I had spent years perfecting control, negotiating with ruthless men in courtrooms, dismantling their arguments piece by piece. But this wasn't a legal battle. This was war. And I had walked straight into an ambush. I repeated Ethan's words back to him, my tone disturbingly even. Raymond is more like a father to you. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah, I didn't look at Raymond. Not yet. I wasn't ready to acknowledge him. Instead, my gaze locked onto Helen. Helen, I said, my voice carrying something sharp, something dangerous. Do you have anything you'd like to say? For the first time, her composure cracked. She inhaled sharply, smoothing down the fabric of her dress as if that small action could erase the weight of what she had done. She wasn't prepared for this conversation. That was my first victory. I think it's best if we all just... I lifted a hand, cutting her off. No. No rehearsed speeches. No easy outs. My voice was steady, cold. Tell me, Helen, when exactly did I stop being your husband? When did I stop being their father? Was it gradual? Or did you decide one night while lying next to me in my bed? Her lips parted, but no words came out. That was my second victory. She had expected me to explode. Or to crumble. But I did neither. I was calculating. Controlled. And then, finally, I turned to Raymond. Raymond, the man I had trusted with everything. The man who had been there when my children were born. Who had stood beside me on my wedding day. Who had celebrated my victories and grieved my losses like a brother. And now, here he was. In my house. Waiting for me to acknowledge that he had won. Waiting for me to lose it. I smiled. A slow, quiet, unsettling smile. The kind of smile that had rattled opposing lawyers in the courtroom more times than I could count. For the first time, Raymond's confidence wavered. And that was my third victory. I let out a slow breath, stepping back, adjusting my cuffs like this entire situation was nothing more than an amusing inconvenience. The room was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in. But I refused to show it. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Without another word, I turned toward the door. You got something to say? Raymond finally spoke. His voice was smooth, controlled, cocky. I paused, tilting my head just slightly, letting the silence stretch. letting the tension twist itself into something unbearable. Then, I chuckled. Low. Quiet. Knowing. That was my fourth victory. And with that, I walked out. Because this wasn't the night I lost. No. This was the night I prepared. By the time they realized what was coming, it would be far too late. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway, listening. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, movement. A shuffle of feet. The sound of breath being released, tension melting away. They thought I was gone. That was my confirmation. They had expected an explosion. A fight. A desperate demand for answers. But they had no idea who I was. I moved down the hall, passing the framed family photos that now felt like a cruel joke. Smiling faces. Stage happiness. A carefully constructed illusion of loyalty. My wife. My mother. My sons. And Raymond. The betrayal itself wasn't what stunned me most. No. It was how effortlessly they had normalized it. They had decided. Without me. Moved on. Without me. I entered my study, shutting the door with the same eerie calm I had held onto since stepping through that front door. Lowering myself into my chair, I leaned back, folding my hands neatly in front of me. And then, I exhaled. The rage was there, simmering beneath my skin, coiled tight and waiting to be released. It wasn't rage craving destruction anymore. It was strategy, waiting, patient, ready to strike when it mattered most. I could walk back into that living room right now, shatter their fragile little performance, rip the masks off their faces, and make Raymond feel the full weight of the cold that had already settled inside me. But violence? That was fleeting. Pain faded. Bruises healed. Revenge? That needed to last. And for that, I needed patience. The pieces had already started falling into place. I had seen the signs. Not because I was blind, but because I had chosen to trust. My mother's influence had always been strong. Too strong. She had chosen Helen for me, not directly, not explicitly. But she had shaped the narrative, made sure I saw Helen as inevitable. A good wife. A proper woman. Someone who would build a life with me. And she had been right. Helen had been all those things. Until she wasn't. Until she decided that being my wife wasn't enough. I leaned forward, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Raymond. Of all the men in the world, why him? Infidelity was something I had considered before, an occupational hazard when you work as a lawyer. You see too many marriages crumble, too many affairs unfolding behind closed doors. I had once convinced myself that if it ever happened to me, I would know, that I would feel it. But I hadn't. Because this wasn't just a betrayal. This was a transition. A slow, careful replacement. A planned coup. Their mistake? They assumed my silence meant acceptance. They thought I was too old to fight back. Too invested to walk away. But the truth? I was already gone. Not physically. Not yet. But emotionally. Mentally. I had detached. And once a man stops caring, once he stops believing there's anything left to salvage, he becomes dangerous. That was their first mistake. Their second? They assumed I had nothing left to lose. They thought they had taken everything. But they forgot something. I was a lawyer. And power? Power wasn't about emotions. It was about leverage. And I had plenty of that. The plan began to take shape. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling through my contacts. My thumb hovered for half a second before I made the call. Owen, my financial advisor. When he answered, my voice was steady, unshaken. Effective immediately, I want all joint accounts frozen. A beat of hesitation. Then, sir, are you sure? That includes your wife's access. I didn't hesitate. I know exactly what it includes. A pause. Then, understood. Click. First move made. Then, I dialed my lawyer. Graham, I said, my voice smoother now, steadier. I need an expedited divorce filing. Non-negotiable. A pause. Then a sigh. Thomas. Now, Graham. Another pause. Then quiet acceptance. I'll have the paperwork ready by morning. Second move made. And then, finally, I made the last call of the night. An old friend. Someone who owed me favors. Someone who specialized in ruining people. And with that, the wheels began to turn. I sat back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my next steps. They thought they had one. They thought I had walked away, licking my wounds. But I wasn't running. I was preparing. And by the time they realized it, it would be too late. The next morning, the storm didn't arrive with thunder or lightning. It came with silence. It started when Helen went to make her usual morning transfer. Maybe a payment for the house. Maybe a casual splurge on another boutique luxury item she claimed was unnecessary. But this time, the screen blinked red. Transaction declined. She frowned. Refreshed the page. Same message. She tried again, this time on her phone, switching between accounts. Declined. Helen wasn't stupid. She knew something was wrong. Grabbing her coat, she slid into the driver's seat of her Mercedes, the one I had bought her for her birthday, and drove straight to the bank, where reality finally slapped her in the face. The bank manager, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably behind his desk. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his tone cautious. "Yes." Helen snapped, already irritated. "What's the issue?" "My account says there's a security hold. I need it removed." A hesitation. A flicker of regret. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Helen narrowed her eyes. "And why not?" The manager took a breath, clearly wishing he wasn't the one delivering the news. "Because your husband issued a freeze on all joint accounts. His lawyer provided the necessary documents. Legally, we cannot grant you access without his authorization." Helen's breath hitched. "That's ridiculous," she said, a nervous laugh escaping. "I have access to these accounts. I have for years." "Yes, ma'am." The manager nodded politely. "And now you don't." The truth settled in. A slow, creeping horror. I had cut her off. Completely. She had never thought I would do it. Not after all these years. Not after everything we built. She thought I would break. But instead, I let them starve first. The credit cards. By the time Helen left the bank, her hands were shaking as she dialed Raymond's number. Raymond. He froze everything. What do we do? But Raymond had his own problems. Because while Helen was panicking over the bank accounts, I had already moved to phase 2. Her credit cards. While she was storming into the bank, I was shutting down every single line of credit she had access to. By the time she tried to swipe her platinum card at a cafe on her way home, declined. She tried another. Declined. She reached for the emergency card she kept in her purse. Declined. And that was when the real fear set in. Raymond's business collapses. While Helen struggled, Raymond was walking straight into his own personal nightmare. See, Raymond had built his business in large part because of me. Not because he was particularly smart. Not because he was a financial genius. No, because I had pulled the strings. I had gotten him clients. I had given him access to the right people, the right investors, the right markets. And now, I was pulling the rug out from under him. One by one, his major investors started backing out. First, the construction firm that had funneled contracts his way for years, gone. Then, the biggest supplier for his company sent a polite but firm email. "We regret to inform you that, due to unforeseen circumstances, we are terminating our partnership effective immediately." Raymond didn't know it yet, but his business had hours to live. By lunchtime, 2 more investors had walked away. By dinner, his company's cash flow was suffocating. And by the time he checked his own accounts, he was in the red. I hadn't just cut him off from my life. I had cut off his survival. The house of cards collapses. While Helen and Raymond were separately falling apart, my sons, Ethan and Caleb, were about to have their own rude awakening. Because the truth was that they had never really appreciated the life I provided. Everything they had, every luxury car in their driveway, every penny of their Ivy League tuition, was because of me. And yet, they had turned their backs on me. They called Raymond their father. Before I even stepped out of that house, they had already erased me from their lives. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I let them live without me. The first thing to go? Their tuition payments. Ethan, deep into his master's program, suddenly received an email. "Your tuition bill is overdue." If it wasn't settled within a week, his enrollment would be terminated. Caleb, who had grown accustomed to his comfortable, effortless lifestyle, found his monthly allowance wiped out. No notice. No explanation. Just gone. He called his bank. And just like their mother, they got the same cold, detached response. "Your father has revoked all access to these funds. You no longer have authorization." Panic set in. By evening, the phone calls started. Helen called. My sons called. Raymond called. Even my own mother. The very woman who had raised me. The same woman who had played a role in orchestrating this betrayal. She called too. I ignored every single one. Not yet. Not until they fully grasped what had happened. Not until the weight of their choices settled in. Not until they understood, with complete certainty, that the man they had discarded, the man they had replaced, was the very reason they had anything at all. By nightfall, I could picture them all in that same living room. The same room where they had once made their decision. Only this time, the dynamic had shifted. This time, they weren't the ones in control. They were drowning. And I was watching them sink. Meanwhile, Raymond sat in his office, sipping his overpriced coffee, blissfully unaware that his entire world was crumbling. For years, Raymond had relied on connections to build his so-called business. Not hard work. Not intelligence. Just connections. And those connections? They were mine. From the very start, his company had leaned on my influence. My clients. My investors. My name. And I had helped him. I had built him up because, at the time, he was more than a friend. He was like a brother to me. But now, I was going to take it all away. The first blow landed. Investors started pulling out. The first warning sign arrived in the form of an email. Subject? Contract termination. Raymond scanned the message, a frown forming as he read the words. Due to unforeseen financial circumstances, we regret to inform you that our ongoing contract with your firm is terminated effective immediately. His jaw tightened. The sender? One of his biggest investors. The one who kept his cash flow steady. He set his phone down, dragging a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his gut. This had to be a mistake. Something easily fixed with a quick phone call. He dialed immediately, forcing a smile when his contact picked up. Hey, Lucas. Just saw the email. What's going on? A pause. A long one. Then, a heavy sigh. Raymond. I'm sorry, man. I really am. But we can't do business with you anymore. Raymond's grip on the phone tightened. What? Why? What changed since last week? Another stretch of silence. Then, the words that made his stomach drop. Thomas. His entire body went cold. What about him? He forced out. Lucas hesitated again, then lowered his voice. Look, Raymond. I don't know what happened between you two, but let's just say he's making it clear that working with you isn't a smart move. Raymond shot up from his chair, knocking his coffee onto his desk. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Thomas wouldn't do that. He's not, Lucas cut in. He doesn't have to. Raymond, he's a powerful man. A respected one. And between you and me? If I had to choose between keeping business with him or with you. Another pause. I'd pick him every time. Click. The line went dead. The dominoes started to fall. Raymond sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the call ended. No, this wasn't real. Thomas was a lot of things, calculating, strategic, even ruthless in court, but he wasn't the type to ruin someone's entire life. Was he? His phone rang again. Another investor. The message? The same. Then another. And another. By noon, 4 major clients had pulled out. By 3, his suppliers had stopped returning his calls. By 5, his entire company was gasping for air. And then, the final, fatal blow landed. Licenses revoked. Raymond was still trying to process the chaos when his secretary hesitantly stepped into his office, her face pale. Sir, she said carefully. We just received a notice from the licensing board. He looked up, his stomach twisting into knots. What? She swallowed, setting the document on his desk. Slowly, he picked it up and read the first line. Effective immediately, the following business licenses have been revoked due to legal concerns regarding conflicts of interest and ethical violations. The rest of the words blurred. His business was finished. Officially. Legally. Beyond repair. Raymond felt the weight of it hit him as he slumped into his chair, his breath shallow and uneven. This wasn't just a streak of bad luck. It was a calculated attack, a surgical strike. And there was only one person in the world who could pull off something this precise. Thomas. His old friend. His brother in all but blood. The man he had betrayed. Now, Raymond was coming to terms with a harsh reality. Thomas didn't just settle scores. He ensured you never stood up again. By the time Raymond could think straight, his phone was flooded with 71 missed calls. Half were from Helen. The rest? Investors, employees, clients, every single one desperate for answers, scrambling to understand what was happening. But through it all, Thomas hadn't picked up once. Grinding his teeth, Raymond called again. Straight to voicemail. The same automated message he had heard all day. You've reached Thomas Mercer. I'm unavailable. Leave a message. Beep. Raymond exhaled sharply, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. Thomas, he started, his voice raw with frustration. I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop. Silence. He swallowed hard. Look, I know we need to talk. Just call me back, okay? This has gone far enough. Click. Call ended. Message ignored. Raymond stared at his phone, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. For the first time in his life, fear crept in. Because Thomas wasn't just angry. He wasn't just getting even. He was wiping Raymond from existence. And there wasn't a damn thing Raymond could do about it. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Helen sat in the living room, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The soft glow of the lamp beside her barely illuminated the worry etched into her face. She had called Thomas. Again and again. No answer. Not even a single response. Her hands trembled as she dialed Raymond next, but deep down, she already knew what she'd hear. The same automated message. The number you are trying to reach is unavailable. Exhaling shakily, she looked across the room. Ethan sat stiffly on the couch, staring at his laptop, unmoving. His screen was frozen on a notification, one he wished he had never seen. Caleb, on the other hand, paced the room, unable to sit still. He never handled setbacks well, and right now, nothing in their world was going right. Helen knew it. Her sons knew it. But no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Because that would mean admitting it, accepting that Thomas had done what they thought was impossible. He had torn apart everything they had taken for granted. Ethan hadn't spoken in over an hour. Not since he logged into his student portal to check his tuition payment. Not since he saw the bold, red notification at the top of his screen. Urgent. Tuition payment past due. Immediate payment required to remain enrolled. His stomach dropped. That had to be a mistake. His tuition was always paid ahead of time. He never even had to think about it. But as he dug into his financial records, his heart pounded. The money was gone. His father had pulled everything. Ethan had never questioned it before. He had always assumed his education was a guarantee, just another thing his father provided without a second thought. But now, that certainty was gone. And he thought back to what he had said just last night. Uncle Raymond is more like a father to us now. His stomach twisted. He had chosen wrong. Caleb was the first to break the silence. Mom, he snapped, running a frustrated hand through his hair. I just tried to buy gas. My card got declined. Again. Helen barely reacted. She just kept staring at her phone, lost in thought. Caleb scoffed, throwing his arms out. I called the bank. Guess what? My account's been drained. He turned to his mother and brother, waiting for someone to say something, anything. Are we just gonna sit here? Dad cut us off. Ethan clenched his jaw but stayed quiet. Helen, however, finally let out a slow, steady breath. Yes, she admitted. He did. Caleb let out a bitter laugh. Well, isn't that just great? What did you expect? You let Uncle Raymond walk all over him, and now we're all paying for it. Helen's eyes snapped to her son, her voice sharp. I didn't let Raymond do anything. She stopped herself, inhaling deeply before speaking again. Your father. She hesitated, exhaling sharply. Your father is just retaliating. That's all. Caleb scoffed. Retaliating? Mom, wake up. Dad isn't just getting back at us. He's burning everything down. And for the first time that day, Helen believed it. Then came the phone call that changed everything. When the house phone rang, the entire room fell silent. Helen grabbed it so quickly she nearly fumbled it. Thomas, she breathed. But the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was her mother. And her tone was sharp. Cold. Helen, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Are you sitting down? Helen frowned, tightening her grip on the phone. What's wrong? Evelyn exhaled, as if bracing for impact. Then she said the words that made Helen's vision blur. Your father's retirement fund is gone. Helen's mouth went dry. What? She whispered. Evelyn's voice stayed steady, controlled. I checked this morning. The accounts. The ones Thomas managed for us. They're empty. Every last cent. We're broke, Helen. Helen couldn't breathe. That's not possible. Thomas wouldn't. Oh, wouldn't he? Evelyn's voice sharpened. Because I think he would. And I think he just did. Helen's mind reeled. Her father. Her mother. They had trusted Thomas for years. His investments. His financial expertise. His ability to make things work. And now? Now it was all gone. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her own parents were paying the price for her mistake. And for the first time since this all began, she felt something she never expected. Regret. The realization hits. Helen barely remembered hanging up the phone. Everything blurred together. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears. We're broke. Her son's bitter words cut deep. What did you think was going to happen? But above all, Thomas's silence was deafening. She had thought, naively, foolishly, that he would be angry, that he would yell, argue, demand answers. But he hadn't. Instead, he had simply walked away. And in doing so, he had dismantled everything. He had let them make their choice. And then, he had shown them what that choice had cost. Now, as she sat there gripping her phone like a lifeline, Helen finally faced the brutal truth. Thomas wasn't coming back. He wasn't going to fix this. And for the first time in her life, she realized. She had never actually known him. She had known the version of Thomas who sacrificed for them. The version who loved unconditionally. The version who never fought back. But the real Thomas? The real Thomas was the man watching them crumble. And he wasn't lifting a single finger to stop it. The collapse. That night, as Helen lay awake staring at the ceiling, she thought about how quickly everything had fallen apart. One day, that was all it had taken. Yesterday, she thought she had everything. Today, she had nothing. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. Helen had never known fear like this. Not when she was a broke college student barely scraping by. Not when she was a young mother, overwhelmed and exhausted. Not even when she realized she no longer loved her husband the way she once had. No, this fear was different. Because this time, it wasn't just about her. This time, she had lost everything. And worse, she had no idea how to fix it. The house was in chaos. Her sons were panicking. Her mother was calling nonstop. Raymond had gone silent. And the only person who could fix it, the man she had betrayed, wasn't answering. The calls began. She tried one more time. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. Straight to voicemail. You've reached Thomas Mercer. I'm unavailable. Leave a message. Helen clenched her jaw, swallowing against the lump in her throat. He was ignoring her. She tried texting. No response. She emailed. Nothing. Desperation took over. She grabbed the house phone. Because surely, he wouldn't ignore a call from his own home. But he did. And that's when she knew. This wasn't a game. Thomas wasn't coming back. The sons begged. Ethan and Caleb had never worried about money before. It had always been there. Until now. Until their father, the man they had dismissed, replaced, and mocked, had taken it all away. And they weren't handling it well. I don't understand, Ethan muttered, pacing. He can't just cut us off like this, can he? Caleb scoffed. Yeah, genius. He just did. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Okay, but Mom, he won't let us go homeless, right? He won't actually abandon us. Helen swallowed hard. She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell them that Thomas would come back. But the words wouldn't come to her. She wasn't even sure anymore. Caleb grabbed his phone. Forget it. I'll call him myself. He dialed. Voicemail. Ethan tried next. Voicemail. Then, they resorted to pleading. Dad, come on. We were just upset. We didn't mean it. You're still our father, all right? Just call us back. Dad, please. We're sorry. We need you. But Thomas never picked up. And the silence was worse than anything he could have said. That was Helen's last attempt. Helen knew what she had to do. She had to see him, to make him listen, to make him forgive her. So, she got into her car, the one Thomas had bought for her, and drove straight to his office. But when she arrived, the receptionist stopped her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer, the woman said, her tone carefully neutral. Mr. Mercer has specifically requested not to see you. Helen's stomach dropped. Not see her? Her own husband? She forced a smile. Maybe you misunderstood. We're married. He'll see me. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then with quiet sympathy, handed Helen an envelope. Helen took it with trembling hands, her heart racing. She stepped aside, ripped it open, and pulled out a single document. A divorce petition. Filed. Signed. Ready. Attached was a note with 5 simple words. There's nothing left to fix. Helen couldn't breathe. She had lost. And Thomas? Thomas had already moved on. That night, when Helen returned home, her mother was waiting. Evelyn was sitting in the living room, hands clasped, watching Helen stumble in, looking shell-shocked. Evelyn already knew. Helen could see it in her eyes, the disappointment, the resignation, the judgment. I told you to be careful, Evelyn said, her voice calm but sharp. Helen let out a bitter laugh. Careful? Careful about what, Mother? Evelyn sighed and shook her head. About underestimating a man like Thomas. Helen clenched her fists. You told me. I told you that men adjust. Evelyn interrupted smoothly. I told you your father adjusted. That doesn't mean Thomas would. Evelyn gave Helen a long, cold look. I told you what you needed to do to keep him. And instead, you let your pride ruin everything. Helen gritted her teeth. I just wanted my freedom. Evelyn nodded. And now you have it. Tell me, how does it feel? Helen said nothing because the truth was, it felt like hell. By midnight, Raymond finally broke. His business was gone, his finances in ruins, and his best friend had destroyed him. For the first time, he realized why. Because he deserved it. Thomas had trusted him. Thomas had built him up, and he had betrayed him. But Raymond wasn't going to accept this. He did the one thing left to him. He drove to Thomas's house, stormed up the front steps, and pounded on the door. Thomas, he shouted, come out and face me. Silence. Then, slowly, the door opened, and there stood Thomas, calm, unbothered, cold. Raymond's anger faltered. The man standing in front of him wasn't angry. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't seeking revenge. Thomas had already won. And Raymond? Raymond was already finished. Thomas tilted his head slightly. What exactly do you want, Raymond? He asked, his voice eerily calm. Raymond swallowed. You ruined me. Thomas nodded. Yes. Raymond clenched his fists. You had no right. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes cold and dangerous. I had every right, he murmured. And for the first time in his life, Raymond felt fear. Because Thomas wasn't just getting even. He was making sure Raymond would never stand again. Helen made one last call that night. One last attempt. One final plea. Thomas, please. We were wrong. I was wrong. Just talk to me. Just give me one more chance. But there was no answer. And this time, there never would be. Because Thomas was already gone. And he wasn't looking back. I watched the phone vibrate on the table. Helen. Again. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't hear it. Not because I was busy. But because she didn't deserve an answer anymore. I let it ring. And ring. Until it stopped. Then, a minute later, another call. This time, the calls came from Ethan, then Caleb, then Helen's mother. One after another. I let each one go to voicemail. For the first time in 19 years, I didn't owe them anything. Not my time. Not my patience. Not my presence. And certainly not my forgiveness. I knew it wouldn't end there. I knew Helen well enough to anticipate her next move. So when she showed up at my office the next morning, I wasn't shocked. She barged past the receptionist before anyone could stop her, slamming the door behind her. I leaned back in my chair, watching her. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. She was desperate now. Good. She deserved to be. Thomas, she began, her voice raw. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence hang in the air, letting it do the work. She took a deep breath, swallowing hard. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you. I tilted my head slightly. Which part, Helen? The lying? The betrayal? The planning? Or the fact that you didn't stop until I caught you? She flinched. That was the truth, wasn't it? She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry that I found out. She took another step forward. Thomas, please, she whispered. I love you. I exhaled slowly, quietly. Then I stood, walked around the desk, and stopped right in front of her. And I said the words that would finally end it all. No, you don't, Helen. Her breath caught, and her lips trembled. I didn't stop, I continued. You never did. Not in the way that mattered. Her eyes filled with tears. That's not true. I cut her off. You loved what I did for you. You loved what I provided. You loved the security, the lifestyle, the illusion. But me? The man? The husband? You haven't loved me for years, Helen. Maybe you never did. She shook her head rapidly, stepping closer. That's not true. I made a mistake. I smiled. A small, cold, knowing smile. The one that made her stop in her tracks. You didn't make a mistake, Helen, I said softly. You made a choice. And now, you have to live with it. By the time I got home that evening, my sons were waiting for me. Ethan and Caleb stood in the living room, arms crossed, their faces grim. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, Ethan spoke. Dad, come on, he said, his voice tight. Isn't this a little extreme? I didn't respond. He sighed. I mean, okay, we get it. Mom screwed up. But don't you think ruining us is a bit much? I raised an eyebrow. Ruining you? I repeated, my voice flat. Caleb scoffed, shaking his head. Dad, we have nothing left. No money. No security. No future. I let that hang between us for a moment. Then I pushed off the door, walked up to them, and said the words that would finally make them understand. Welcome to the life you thought I didn't matter in. Ethan snapped his mouth shut. Caleb swallowed hard. I tilted my head. You thought I was just there. Just existing. That my presence was optional. That I was just a provider. A bank account. And when you thought you had a replacement. I let out a quiet chuckle. You dismissed me like I was nothing. They didn't speak. They knew I was right. And now? Now they wanted me to fix it. They wanted my money. My security. My presence. But they had already chosen. And so had I. That night, I should have expected it. Raymond's final, desperate attempt. As I was packing the last of my things, Raymond showed up, banging on my door. I opened it without surprise. He stood there, looking like a man who had lost everything. Because he had. Thomas, he started, his voice rough. We need to talk. I didn't move. I didn't invite him in. I just looked at him. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand over his face. I screwed up, he muttered. I know that. But you destroyed me. You ruined my business, my reputation, my entire damn life. I let him talk, let him spill his excuses, his regrets, his pathetic attempts to shift the blame. Then, finally, I spoke. Good. Raymond blinked. What? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Good. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. To be betrayed by someone you trusted. To have the people you cared about turn their backs on you. He swallowed hard. Thomas, I didn't mean. I cut him off. You did. And that's why I don't care. His face went pale. For the first time, he understood. There was nothing to fix. No forgiveness. No second chances. I let the silence stretch between us. Then, finally, I shut the door. And locked it. Because Raymond? Raymond was already dead to me. The goodbye that wasn't really a goodbye. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. I had everything I needed. My wealth. My power. My freedom. I walked through the house one last time, letting my fingers glide over the furniture, the walls, the remnants of a life that was never really mine. And then, without a second glance, I walked out the door, leaving them behind. For good. And you know what? The best part? I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel any regret. I felt free. Finally. Completely. Free. I stepped into the hotel lobby, feeling lighter than I had in years. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. Welcome, Mr. Mercer. Your suite is ready. Thank you, I said, handing over my card, the one no one could touch. As she processed my check-in, I glanced at my phone. 67 missed calls. I let out a slow breath and shook my head. They were still begging. Still scrambling to reach me. Still trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But it was too late. Because for the first time in 19 years, I wasn't theirs to manipulate anymore. I was done. And they? They were exactly where they deserved to be. The fallout begins. By the next morning, the desperation reached a peak. I ignored their calls all night, but the messages kept coming. Helen, Thomas, please. I'm begging you. Just talk to me. Ethan, Dad, come on. Let's just meet and figure this out. Caleb, we screwed up. We know that. But we're still your family. Evelyn, Thomas, enough of this. You've made your point. That last one almost made me laugh. Made my point. No, I wasn't done making my point. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, watching everything unravel from a distance. Helen faces reality. Helen must have finally realized how deep she was in when she went to the bank again. But this time, she wasn't just trying to access her frozen accounts. She was trying to save herself. She wanted a loan. A desperate, last-ditch attempt to keep the illusion alive that everything wasn't falling apart. But she should have known better. When the loan officer looked at her records, all he saw was a woman with no financial stability. No job. No steady income. Nothing of her own. She had been comfortable for too long, relying on my money, my name, my influence. Now, she had none of it. So when the bank denied her loan request, she walked out with a stunned, broken expression. Because, for the first time in her life, she truly had nothing. Ethan and Caleb learned the hard way. Ethan tried to keep up his usual bravado. He called his college, demanding an extension on his tuition. He argued. He negotiated. He tried to leverage my name. But my name? It didn't belong to him anymore. The financial aid office wasn't interested in his excuses. They gave him a 7-day deadline. If he didn't come up with the payment, he was out. Caleb, meanwhile, got his wake-up call when he went to get his car serviced, only to find out the payments hadn't gone through. That's when it hit him. He didn't own his car. I did. And now? Now, the repo company was on its way to take it back. I could almost see the look on his face when he realized he wasn't as independent as he'd thought. For years, he had seen me as just a wallet. But now? Now, he knew what it was like to live without it. Raymond's final collapse. Raymond? He was drowning. For years, he had ridden on my connections, my influence, my generosity. He'd stolen my wife, my family, my place. And now? Now, he had nothing. The moment I cut him off, his investors scattered. His business was already a corpse. But the real kicker? The lawsuits started rolling in. All those clients he'd screwed over. The ones he'd overcharged. The ones he'd misled. The ones who had trusted him because I vouched for him. They were coming for him now. And without my protection? He was finished. I imagined him sitting at his desk, staring at the pile of legal notices, realizing that the man he thought he had replaced had completely destroyed him. Good. Let him rot. The moment they broke. By the third day, the calls slowed. The messages turned from anger to pleading. They weren't demanding anymore. They weren't telling me to be reasonable. They were begging. And that's when I knew. I had won. I had finally shattered their hold over me. Sitting in my hotel suite, I scrolled through the messages, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Because, for the first time in ages, I was free. Free in a way I hadn't been since I married Helen. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fit into the mold of the perfect husband, the perfect provider. I wasn't just a safety net, a backup plan, or a wallet to someone. I was simply myself. And honestly, I liked it. Then came the final call. It was a Friday evening, and I didn't expect to answer. But for some reason, I picked it up. It wasn't out of sympathy, and it wasn't out of regret. It was just curiosity. I pressed the phone to my ear. Silence. And then, Helen's voice, small, almost fragile. Thomas. I didn't say anything. She let out a shaky breath. I don't even know what to say, she whispered. I took a sip of my drink. Then don't say anything. A pause. She tried again. I need to understand. How did we end up here? I almost laughed. As if she didn't already know. But I answered anyway. We ended up here the moment you decided I was replaceable. She broke into a soft sob. Can't we fix this? She asked, almost pleading. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. No, Helen, I said, my voice calm. We can't. Another silence stretched between us. Then, her final plea. Thomas, I still love you. I couldn't help but smile. A slow, victorious smile. And then, finally, I gave her my answer. That's nice, I said. But I don't love you. And with that, I hung up. The last laugh. I leaned back in my chair, stretching. Outside my window, the city lights sparkled, endless, filled with possibilities. I was free. And them? They were drowning in their own mess. But that wasn't my problem anymore. Not anymore. I had made my choice. I had walked away. And for the first time in 21 years, I was truly, completely, unapologetically happy.